Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee on a Comprehensive Job Creation Plan. Today's December 2nd, 2015. I'm Paul Krikorian, and I'm joined by my colleague, our Council President, Herb Wesson, and Mr. Price, I believe, is on his way. Mr. Blumenfield is still tied up in another committee, but we hope he'll be joining us soon as well. At our first meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee, we heard a fairly comprehensive overview of the state of the economy in Los Angeles, what types of industry clusters have grown, what are anticipated to grow in the future, what are the areas that we have shown strength, and what are the areas where we have suffered setbacks. At our second meeting, we heard from the general manager of EWDD and others about the tools that are currently being used by the city, plans that we have to rebuild the capacity of EWDD, the priorities for the department, other ways that we are engaged right now in coordinating the city's economic development and marketing strategies. So today, we're going to have a broader discussion about new tools. One existing tool and three new tools that we might be able to utilize in a more robust way to try to fill some of the gap that was taken away from the city when we lost community redevelopment because of a decision of the state legislature during the state's struggles to balance its budget. So the city has obviously felt a significant impact by that loss of community redevelopment, and yet there are other opportunities that we have to try to fill some of that gap, to try to inject new sources of funds into an economic development strategy, and we're going to hear about a number of those today. So we'll be taking up items 1, 2, 3, and 4 together. They deal with motions regarding business improvement districts, AB2, community investment, AB2 districts, enhanced infrastructure financing districts, as well as the new proposal that that pursuant to my motion, using the city charter's authority for economic development incentive zones. So we'll be hearing all those together. Before we begin those, and by the way, we'll be taking general public comment at the conclusion of the meeting, but I do have cards right now from Ms. Patricia McAllister on items 1, 3, and 4. So Ms. McAllister, if you, yes, 1, 3, and 4. So if you'd like to come up and speak to each of those items in a consolidated way, I'd be happy to give you 3 minutes to speak on.
Sure, 3 minutes, sure. Okay, thank you. My concern is illegal aliens getting the jobs. I am familiar with the WorkSource Development Department and some WorkSource centers. I've actually gone into some of them, and one at 1055 Wilshire, Pace. They'll tell you right out, they only have Hispanics working in there, and you ask them, why don't you have African Americans? They say, well, they are here because they're going to go to other work sources and get jobs for people who don't speak English. So when you don't speak English, you're illegal. So what I'm seeing here is a big problem with the WorkSource centers, and I don't think we should be investing a dime until we get Americans, and I'm speaking specifically for African Americans. But then it's an overall problem too. But African Americans, these jobs, I pay my taxes. I shouldn't have to go in a WorkSource center where they only train. So this is volunteer work. They only train Hispanics to go to Hispanic WorkSource centers and get illegals jobs. This is a slap in the face. We do have immigration laws here. So that's that motion number 1. Number 2, to work with them to build more economic development sources. Well, I'm familiar with this one at 1055. They also have other kinds of workshops in there where they charge you for learning this and that. I don't think we should combine these two resources. For one, they discriminate, and the other, if you want certain services, you have to pay. 1055 Wilshire is called PACE. I think that that is a conflict of interest, and it shouldn't be that way. If we don't address the illegal alien problem, none of this means nothing. Whether it's jobs, housing, shelters, nothing. Because the illegals are causing all the problems in the nation. So we have to address that. Now, this motion here, number 3, direct the chief legislative analyst with the assistance of the city administrative officer to determine which of the 31 former community redevelopment agency Los Angeles communities located out of those areas should get economic development support. Well, I don't think we need to do that until we get these illegals out of there. We should have laws and regulations that say if you are not a citizen of this nation, you cannot use our resource centers. For one thing, you're not supposed to be working. So that tells me why you shouldn't be able to use the resource centers. You should be out of this country. And until we resolve that and follow the law, we have laws in this country which California and a lot of other states are ignoring. We're becoming a lawless nation. Illegals are causing all the problems. That's why we're having all these mass shootings. We had one in San Bernardino today. People are frustrated. They can't find jobs. They're living on the street. They can't get housing. It's all because of this illegal alien problem. And this work source stuff is full of illegal aliens. And I know because I do a lot of investigations.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is David Roberts. Mr. Roberts? Oh, there you go. Speaking on item number 3.
Item number 3. Good afternoon, Chair. I'm with Councilmember Buscaino's office, David Roberts, Director for Economic Development and Planning. Just wanted to bring up a couple of points with regards to the motion regarding AB2. Obviously, community redevelopment and the redevelopment agency was probably the most powerful tool in the city's economic development toolbox. Since the CRA project areas were disbanded a number of years ago, it's become increasingly more difficult to fund revitalization efforts. And we've seen, the difficulty and the slowdown with affordable housing production, homeless issues, addressing public infrastructure in a lot of underserved communities. That was a tool that the redevelopment agencies used to play an important and an integral part of. I think your district, CD2, had North Hollywood. Councilmember West and Council President West, and I think had Mid-Cities, Crenshaw, and some other redevelopment project areas. And there's probably efforts that you would love to have a potential funding source to finance some of those gaps. As part of the suggestion from our office is to perhaps look at the opportunity to hire an outside consultant, or the question is, can this research, can this study be done internally? EWDD, CAO, CLA, what tools are available, or perhaps do we need to go outside and have a consultant do the work? If we do, what is potentially the estimated cost to do that study? And then third, what are the potential sources? Is there potential block grant dollars to do it? The CAO's office have resources. Maybe it makes sense, again, maybe go into the general fund. Because if we look long term, I think we're getting about $50–60 million a year in boomerang dollars coming back from the redevelopment agency. If those were opportunities to put that $50 or $60 million in those 31 project areas, it's perhaps worth an investment in a study to look at 2 or 3 years from now and having those development dollars for housing and other infrastructure needs.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Any other cards? Mr. Howland? No card? All right. Okay. Want to make sure that we're on top of this. All right. Then I'm going to go ahead and invite up staff to present on each of these 4 items. We can do it all at once. So our city clerk and our general manager of VWDD, welcome in the CLA. So I thought what we would do to start this discussion is, as I said, we're currently using bids. We have, how many bids do we have, Ms. Walcott, around the city right now?
I think there's 38.
Okay. So we already have the bid tool in the toolbox. One of the things we're going to want to explore is how can we use bids more broadly? How can we encourage the development of more bids where it's appropriate? How can we use them more effectively in terms of jobs creation and economic development? But there's also these three new mechanisms that I want to talk about as well. And so I think we should start the discussion, if we can, by comparing those three. And so I'd like to ask the CLA to give us kind of an overview of both what is an enhanced infrastructure finance district, what is a community revitalization and investment authority, and how do they compare and contrast, and then how does that compare to what we used to be able to do with under the CRA? So why don't we start with that overview, and then we can move on from there.
Okay, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Dora Huerta with the Office of the Chief Legislative Analyst. Our office was directed to, I'll begin with the presentation on AB2, and then we'll move
Great.
into the other sections, if
Great.
you will. The motion relative to AB2 directs our office to provide an analysis of AB2, which was signed by Governor Brown September 2015. AB2 becomes effective January 1st, 2016, and will authorize local agencies to create a community revitalization authority to carry out provisions of the community redevelopment law pertaining to affordable housing, economic revitalization, and infrastructure improvements. The motion also requests that our office study the former CRA 31 redevelopment areas and other areas that may be eligible to form revitalization authorities, or CREAs, as for short. AB2 allows for the formation of CREAs by legislative bodies in two ways. Individually, a legislative body of a city, county, or city and county may adopt a resolution to create an authority, or it may also collectively work with the city, and county, or special districts, and through a joint powers agreement. The membership under option 1, where it can individually be formed, would be comprised of a 5-member board, with members appointed by the legislative body, 3 members of the legislative body, and 2 public members who live or work in the area. Under 2 collectively, the majority of the members of the board would be from legislative bodies that created the authority, and a minimum of 2 public members who live or work in the area. Authority participation limitations include, there's limitations that note that school entities may not participate, successor agencies may not participate. An authority may be formed by a city or county that created a redevelopment agency that was dissolved, but shall not become effective until the successor entity or designated local authority has adopted certain findings, including a finding of completion, and no former redevelopment agency assets which are a subject of litigation against the state have or will be used to benefit the new authority unless the litigation has been resolved. In terms of the area boundaries, not less than 80% of the land calculated shall include land in which the household median income is less than 80% of the annual median income, and 3 of the following conditions: non-seasonal unemployment that is at least 3% higher than the statewide median income, crime rates that are 5% higher than the statewide median income, deteriorated or inadequate infrastructure like streets, sidewalks, water supply, and parks. And 4th, deteriorated commercial or residential structures. Alternative boundaries could be within a former military base that is deteriorated or has inadequate infrastructure. Some of the uses of funds include repair, upgrade or construct infrastructure, low and moderate income housing, addressing hazardous substances, seismic retrofits, acquiring and transferring real property, and making loans or grants to owners to improve and rehabilitate buildings and structures. The sources of funding for these areas include mostly tax increment generated from the area, with a percentage from the consenting taxing entities in the percentage that the taxing entities wish to contribute. Consenting entities may also advance funds to the authority. Taxing agencies, again, cannot exclude the school entity. Authority may issue bonds to service the tax increment, serviced by the tax increment, subject to protest. They may also borrow and receive grants and other funding. The authority would need to adopt a plan with different goals and objectives, outlining the programs to remediate or address the issues, such as hazardous substances, housing unit production, and any economic revitalization efforts. Plan participation. Prior to or adopting a plan, a participating entity may adopt a resolution allocating its share of tax increment. A resolution may be repealed by the county auditor, may be repealed by giving the county auditor controller 60 days notice. However, the county controller will need to continue to allocate that entity's share of tax increment until all of the debt, the repayment of debt and the obligations have been fully repaid. The authority shall dissolve no later than 45 years. And under the plan adoption process, 3 public hearings must be held. And at the 3rd public hearing, if there's less than 25% protest, the authority can adopt the plan. If there's protest between 25 and 50% of the combined number of residents and owners that file a protest, an election shall take place. If 50% plus 1 of those participants file a protest, then proceedings must be abandoned on that plan. There are provisions for periodic plan review, where the authority will need to review the plan. The authority shall adopt an annual report and review the plan every 10 years and conduct public hearings as well and listen to public protest. CREAs may include land currently designated redevelopment area. However, any existing enforceable obligations will be subordinate, must be addressed, and so any increment payable to the authority would be subordinate to any pre-existing enforceable obligations. So those would need to be met. Under CREAs, there is a 25% set aside for affordable housing as a requirement under the law, and there are replacement and relocation requirements under affordable housing provisions. CREA is different than EIFDs in that it may exercise eminent domain similar to CRA within the first 12 years of adoption of the plan. And again, this law goes into effect January 1st, 2016.
Okay, so before we go on to EIFDs, let me just see if I can clarify that in my own head. So first of all, this affords us the opportunity to use tax increment, but a significantly reduced tax increment because we can only use our own, essentially, unless we join together with the county, in which case the county and the city together can use the county and city portion of the tax increment.
That's correct.
So any sense of, or maybe Ms. Perry, if you have a sense of this, do we have even a general sense of how that would compare in terms of gross dollars in a typical case to the old CRA funding model? In other words, how much of the tax increment under the CRA's model would have come from a city and county tax increment as opposed to special districts, school districts, and all the others? Do you have any sense of percentage on that?
No, let's see. I think maybe, yeah, actually we do. I'm sorry.
Oh.
The staff backed out some numbers today. Under the former redevelopment agency, with city, county, and school tax increment over a base year property tax levels, 27% of the funds came from the city, 25% of funds came from the county, 46% of funds came from the school district.
Wow.
2% of funds from other taxing entities, which might be a water district or a special assessment or whatever. So, obviously not being able to have that large chunk but on the other hand, you may look at it as we don't have anything right now.
That's right. It's a glass half full.
Yes.
And literally half full, it sounds like. It's just, so if we get together
Yeah,
with
it
the
is,
county
actually,
and do
pretty
these
much.
jointly, the glass is about half full. We get
Close, yes.
Yeah, okay. That ain't nothing.
Nothing to sneeze at.
All right, and then the 25% set aside for affordable housing, does that mean 25% of what? Of housing units built, or is it of gross spending by the CREA?
Gross spending, usually.
So, okay.
25%.
So 25% of their budget in their development plan has to be devoted to affordable housing.
Correct.
And is it, do they give any definition of that, of what affordable housing is? It, low income, ultra low income? Is it?
Yes, I believe it's very similar to community redevelopment law.
Okay.
So, very similar provisions.
And now, Mr. Roberts was asking about, the possibility of a consultant to prepare a report to do. There's any correlation, any geographical correlation between a potential CREA area and a previous CRA area would really be coincidental. There's no, in other words, there's no legal reason that a CREA area has to have any connection with a previous community redevelopment area, right?
Under previous redevelopment blight definitions, I believe there were also, it included deteriorated infrastructures or some similar
I'm going to get to
criteria.
that, but what I mean is the legal boundaries
Oh,
of the
yes.
previous CRA areas are out the window. We're starting with a clean slate.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so what we need to do in order to identify the areas that would be eligible for a CREA, you're right, identifying areas of the city with deteriorated infrastructure, deteriorated streets or sidewalks, it's going to be a pretty big map of the city. So those two factors are going to be pretty easy to meet in most places, I think. The key is going to be the two statistical definitions, the 3% higher unemployment rate and or the 5% higher crime rate. So if we meet either one of those and we meet the 80% income requirement, then we'll be able to, more than likely, we'll be able to identify a blighted area that would be eligible as a CREA, because we'll be able to find deteriorated. By the way, who makes the assessment of what constitutes deteriorated infrastructure or streets or sidewalks?
That's a very good question.
Is that done by the board subjectively?
So that's, locally defined. The legislation's very clear on the first three. In fact, they give websites for where you can pull the income, unemployment, and crime rates. But for the definition of deteriorated, I think they give us more flexibility, I believe. So maybe work to our advantage to come up with some local definition.
I guess that would have to be identified by the council first, since we wouldn't have a governing board in place to make that determination until we determine the area, right? So if we make that determination of those zones, then you identify a governing board to set up to create the CREA in that zone. Okay, well, that's good to know. By the way, welcome, Mr. Price. We're taking up all four items together right at the moment. We're talking about AB2 authorities under AB2. Okay, so further to this issue of getting a consultant, seems to me that if we're just looking at those three statistical measures, 80% of income, 3% greater unemployment, and 5% higher crime rate, we have that information right now. We can look at it by census tracts, and we can pull it up like that and map it within a week, couldn't we?
Let me give you two answers to that. Yes, you are right, and we can work with information technology, and we can work with sanitation, public works to be able to gather that information through geographic information systems. But I also want to let you know that we do have an RFP that's out, and the responses are due back on December the 9th. And this is for the citywide establishment, the question of a citywide establishment of an enhanced infrastructure financing district. And that could be a framework under which we can continue the assessment, whether you go CREA or IFD or have an IFD within a CREA, it's all still the same assessment. You go to the capacity analysis, the amount of potential tax increment you could generate, the stakeholder interest, the level of sensitivity to having either an EIFD or a CREA, and a matrix, the area-wide funding capacity, and then sub-area capacity. So this is separate and distinct from the river EIFD consultants who have already been retained and are under contract. But again, it's the information that they gather we'll be able to use, and we can also obviously use our own internal capacity to be able to put together something rather quickly through GIS.
So, I was going to get to that. The RFP that's out right now is to create this comprehensive EIFD strategy for the city.
Yes.
So, that would clearly inform our decision-making about whether we wanted to use a CREA. But it wouldn't encompass that geographical definition because that's statutorily new under AB2.
Correct, but we can ask the consultant within the context of that
Exactly.
to give us 15 different scenarios, one that would, focus on an EIFD, and obviously they'd have to do stakeholder analysis, which includes the elected official for the area to see where their focus is on an EIFD, as it's not as formulaic as a CREA would be.
Right.
As a CREA, you're right, you can just go through GIS and do the mapping on it, and then, we kind of draw circles around where we hit the 3 plus the 80%.
Right. Are those resources available to your department?
Yes.
Okay. So then, since this doesn't take effect until the first of the year anyway, perhaps by our next meeting here in January, if we could at least get a map of which areas would meet those statistical definitions, then I think that would give us the beginning of a discussion about, okay, well, this is what it would look like if we were to move forward with CRAs in this area. That would be helpful. And then when do you expect that RFP process is, no, I'm sorry, they're already out. They're already
out.
working.
It's
The
out. They're
consultant
supposed to
is
turn
working,
in
so-
and respond on the 9th. We expect we should be obviously done. We'll be doing the analysis and the review and the scoring over the holiday season and probably have them done, what was that, Samuel, mid-January?
Have the proposals back?
Yeah, and have a decision.
Yeah, the proposal should be back probably first week or two of March.
Okay. So,
I'm sorry, to
First
have
week
the
or two in
report
March.
back, or to have the, I'm sorry, I guess I'm lost in the process. We had the RFP out.
responses are in on December the 9th. Sure. We have to score them, and we have different teams for scoring. So why don't you come on? This is Samuel Hughes. He's our AGM for Economic Development.
No,
Well-
briefly, thank you. No, briefly, with respect to this, the announcement is out. The responses are due December 9th, and we'll evaluate the same. And the thought is, once a consultant is selected, we'll issue the notice to proceed, and it'll probably take them about 2.5 months or so
Okay.
to get a study back to us
Okay.
that we in turn can report on.
Okay. So by March, then,
We should have a report back to you, to committee. But in the meantime, we can go ahead and work with IT and Public Works and do the overlays based on what CREO requires of us, of an area, or defining an area by income, crime rate, employment status, and on the issue of aging infrastructure. I think we can get the aging infrastructure information fairly directly from Public Works.
yeah, and since that's a subjective measure,
Yeah.
honestly.
It's all going to be different in
I
different
think
areas.
If we get the objective statistical information down, it'll be pretty easy for us to meet the subjective
Yeah.
requirements
Right.
within those areas. Great, thank you. I want to go into the other areas, the EIFDs, and also the Charter Authority for Economic Development Incentives. But before I do, I want to ask Mr. West and Mr. Price if you have any questions on the AB2 area that we just discussed.
I did have something I wanted to ask you about. You referenced eminent domain, and if you could give me a little bit more on that. I think I was not paying attention, but I heard that, and if you could review that part of it.
Sure. Under CREA, once an authority is formed, it may exercise eminent domain for the first 12 years after it's adopted a plan in the area. So the authorities form, it adopts a plan, what it wants to carry out, the type of objectives in a work plan, and within those first 12 years, it can enact eminent domain to acquire property.
And that authority is the same as it would have been under CRA,
I believe so.
yeah, except for that 12-year requirement. Mr. Price?
Thank you. Thanks for the overview, and I apologize for being a little late. You may have hit some of this before. I know that initially, under the IFDs, there was obviously the need for the county to opt in. I know it's a part here, also under the CREA. Is it as stringent, as restrictive, the opt-in requirement for CREA as is the EIFD? Or do we know yet? Does it really?
Under both scenarios, the other entities would need to opt in. So a CREA can be formed individually, via resolution, where the city would just create its own CREA and set aside tax increment to carry out the work plan, or it can partner with the county and other special districts through a joint powers authority. But they must opt in voluntarily, and they must also specify the percentage that they want to contribute voluntarily versus CRA where,
And I guess that's subject to negotiation,
that's right.
deal by deal, or is it sort of a blanket
No, I think it
arrangement?
have to be negotiated under the joint powers authority. So upfront, but once the resolution is passed, they can also, I believe, change the percentage or amend the percentage that they contribute, because they can also repeal it at some point as well. But yes, it all have to be negotiated and voluntary.
Okay, well, I know we'll all be anxiously awaiting the report with a decision, first of all, on the consultant, so that we can get that report, because it's, it's going to be I think, an important tool that we can use all over the city, not just on the waterfront.
And just to Mr. Price's point about the county's role in this and negotiating these things. So you mentioned that would be done in creation of the JPA, but there's a separate JPA for each authority, I assume. Is that right? There isn't a citywide blanket GPA. There would be a JPA. There would be a JPA for the such and such CREA that might be separate from a CREA right next door. It might be different in some way than, like, for example, in the percentage negotiated. I mean, maybe the county has more of an interest in economic redevelopment in one area than they do in the other, and it may not match up with our decisions for whatever reason. Maybe there's an area where the boundary of it overlaps the border between a city area and an unincorporated area, for example. I mean, there's different scenarios that I could see happening where each one might be a little bit different, but that's okay.
Right.
We don't have to have a one-size-fits-all approach.
That's right. There will be individual CREAs with individual board compositions, because it does require that the two members of the public live and work within that area. So there will be individual authorities and different plans for each of those districts.
Okay. So what are the big differences between the CREA approach and the EIFD approach? How do those two strategies differ?
AB2 would obviously be very prescribed, right, under the criteria to determine the geographic boundaries. The affordable housing set aside is also a big difference between the two. EIFDs do not require affordable housing component, but CREAs do require 25% set aside.
But on the other hand, EIFDs have a narrower range of types of things that their revenues can be spent on. Is that right too?
They're very similar.
Are they?
I think they're more similar than different in terms of the uses, but they do require the 25% set aside, which is along the lines of the CRA previous requirement of 20%, and the city added another 25%. So those are similarities. There'll be differences in between the EIFDs and AB2s in the bonding requirements. Under EIFDs, if under the financing plan you plan to issue bonds, you'll be required to secure a 55% vote of the property owners, which is not required under AB2. But AB2 does have the requirement in the financing plan that you state whether you will be issuing bonds or not, and that is subject to protest.
Okay.
So I would pass or not pass. The other big difference, of course, is the eminent domain powers between EIFD and CREAs. Under EIFD, I understand that there may be some eminent domain powers under the Polanco Act, but they'd be very limited to environmental. But AB2 would have full eminent domain powers.
So the eminent domain under EFID is specifically for blight removal, right? Or
Under Polanco Act, I believe it has to do with environmental remediation.
oh, okay.
So strictly for that versus.
Okay.
In fact, I missed that my first time around on that. I didn't realize that it did have some, well, I've been told that it does have some type of eminent domain powers, but we'll confirm that in the report.
Okay, and they can both bond against tax increment?
That's right.
as well? Okay. All right. Anything else, members, on EIFDs or CREAs? Okay, now, maybe we'll come back to, because I don't want to leave you sitting there, Holly. So
I'm enjoying the discussion. It's
let's
interesting.
go. Let's talk about bids a little bit. I think, let's see, where's my motion? The motion that was brought on bids asked for a report on best practices, legal issues, and policy restrictions. And I know that we've had some legal issues recently with our bids, which we now have behind us. But
We
with
still have
that,
some, but they're different. They're not against us as opposed to things that we need the law changed or clarified on.
with that in mind, have you had an opportunity yet to kind of look at what are some of the best practices that other cities have been doing that maybe we're not looking, that we haven't been doing yet, or that our bids have not been doing, that maybe we can assist them with, or is that something that you've?
Sure. Holly Walcott, City Clerk. I am pinch hitting today for staff who have taken ill, so I'm speaking very summarily on the issues because the details are with staff. But we have done the comparison of 8 different cities, but primarily the top 2 that were of interest were San Francisco and New York, primarily based on size. We will have a written report at a future meeting. We have most of the draft ready, but I apologize for it not being in written form today. Specific areas where we think can be enhanced from a public information campaign, we've compared with New York does specifically well on public information campaigns, capacity building, and administrative assistance. So we think that by hiring a outreach specialist or putting some money into outreach campaign, which we can do with business improvement district fund dollars, and we're developing an RFP to do that, to help the outreach. New York also
So
has,
one that would be responsible for helping the whole
Yes.
network of bids that
Yes.
exist in the city?
correct, a leadership program, and this would be ongoing training for the bids to help enhance those that need a little bit more assistance. Again, that would same pot of
Is that
money.
modeled after San Francisco again, or is this New York or some other place?
This one was New York. Conducts a 6-month neighborhood leadership program in partnership with their city small business services department and Coro, a local nonprofit, to provide training to select individuals who in turn are charged with exploring, testing, and building effective commercial revitalization strategies that adapt and thrive in challenging environments, including business improvement districts. They also provide ongoing capacity building workshops focused specifically on building the capacity of business improvement districts. So we're recommending that we go in that direction, which again will be in our report. In San Francisco and New York, the business improvement districts are assisted by the city with their cities with ongoing administration support through obtaining and leveraging grants. So the specific recommendation would be that we are allowed to apply for grants on behalf of the bids, and let's see if there was some more to request. Okay, so this was the recommendations, again, for administrative support. Processes, the majority of the other cities that we looked at had e-platforms for submittal of documents, so we think that would help the various bids. Connectedness. In New York and San Francisco, divisions have jurisdiction over their business improvement districts, are housed and are linked to agencies that have mission focused primarily on economic development, providing a cohesive plan and timely access to economic drivers. So what our recommendation is for us all pretty much to work together. Set up a task force of the different departments that are working, and it might work into these plans that you're discussing in other avenues, but it's basically a approach. The legal issues are two, one that Miranda does have in her report and another one that I'm aware of. On the Prop 218, we've had ongoing problems with state law regarding general benefits. While we have, as you know, put a bandage approach on that and made sure that our engineers do at least some type of analysis on defining general benefits, but there's still a lack of clarity in state law of what actually a general benefit is. And so we would need some legislative assistance there. Baseline service agreements, San Francisco and New York have baseline service agreements. This helps when bids are being developed because a lot of times what their concerns are that the bid will go in and then the other services will stop. In other words, if I'm a bid and I start picking up trash off the streets, or I have a security component, then I'm not going to see any police, or the city's going to stop services. So, the recommendation would be to start developing, baseline agreements, with the understanding that there are certain budget and contractual limitations that we have, year to year.
These agreements between the bid and the department?
Right. Well, the baseline services, for example, would be that right now, for example, the city of San Francisco provides in a specific area 1 to 2 beat officers 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., 4 to 7 days a week. So if that's going to be their ongoing, now we also again understand that the way CompStat works and the way the police department operates, you can't necessarily guarantee 2 officers in a specific area based on, criminal activity. But we're looking for overall, what baseline of services can the bids expect so that business owners and property owners don't feel like their funds are paying for things that they should already get. Then the other, I believe there's a report pending in your committee, Mr. Price, on a local ordinance for creating bids, which would semi-mirror the state law on creating bids, but the difference is it would lower the threshold for the petition amount. Currently, it requires 50% of the petition of the total financed amount. It requires a petition through the state law. And if we did a local ordinance, we had one for a while, but it was found it needs to be cleaned up, and change that to 30%, then there may be some incentive for other areas. But we have also strongly believe, me personally, that bids do better in areas where they're organically grown, in that the businesses themselves have to really want it. It can't be imposed on by the city, or things generally don't go well. But we will have a written report that has more details for you. Again, I apologize for I'm just kind of tap dancing here, but
Quite all right, because I understand the reason. So if you could just make sure that at our next meeting in January, if we could have your written report on that as well as specific recommendations,
Sure.
that would be helpful. New York is not burdened by Prop 218,
that is
which is
yeah.
helpful.
Right.
But I just looking at some of the stuff that I've seen from New York, they have 70 bids. 39 of them are in low to moderate income neighborhoods. That's pretty impressive.
Right.
And I'd really like to see us be able to
Yeah,
replicate
and I think
some of
part
that
of that is
success,
selling
especially in
What
low.
occurs here?
It's
in
the
rural areas.
reverse. That's exactly
selling the benefit, letting people know. I think that's part of the PR campaign too.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll look forward to that at the next meeting. Now, don't slip away just yet, because the other issue that we wanted to talk about were the economic development incentive zones pursuant to the authority of Section 104 of the Charter. That was my motion, and in that motion, we called for exploration of a number of different examples of kinds of incentives that might be done pursuant to the charter authority. Is this something that you've looked at, Ms. Perry? So
Yeah.
I don't know if you're prepared to go over the whole list at this point, but maybe you can start with a overview of
Yeah.
the economic development incentive zones, and we'll go from there.
Well, let me go back to put this in context based on what we recently lost, because we can still take those ideas and implement them on a city level. The state enterprise zones and the federal empowerment zones, and as I said in the previous meeting, the state zones expired in 2014, and they had employee hiring tax credits, sales or use tax credits for machinery and equipment, a business expense deduction, a net interest deduction, and the opportunity to take net operating loss carry over for 20 years. So we don't have that, but we may be able to base some city-grown ideas on those concepts. On the federal empowerment zones, which are going to expire at the end of this year, they obviously they credit on employee salaries for new employees living in the zone, 20% of the first $15,000 of each salary for each employee living in the zone, 40% of the first $6,000 for new employees living in the zone, and then 40% of the first $3,000 in summer youth salaries. That could be something really interesting that we could work on, because we have a very active summer youth employment program. We do have 17 work source centers. It would be a great boon and a counterpoint to the increase in the minimum wage, so that we could pull more engagement from the private sector to hire people through our work source centers and to be far more engaged in helping us on the summer youth employment. So just a couple of concepts to put out. You know, the incentives that are in place now, the site plan review waiver on the application fee, reduced parking, you know, planning things, the 3-year business tax exemption for new businesses, and that does expire at the end of December. So, you know. When I look at an AB2 and a CREA, obviously one size is not going to fit all. You know, we do have some opportunity, you know, and I have to be honest with you, this is a chart that I wanted to, you know, share, but Larry Cosmont did it, and so I don't want anybody to think we're, you know, stealing his work, but it was so good that I wanted you to see it, because CREA or EIFD, no matter what you decide, and it may be an EIFD within a CREA or vice versa, we have a lot of different tools to use. With the PACE, which smooths out energy costs on water and energy over the course of 10 years. We have the capacity to do joint powers authorities. We have the capacity to upzone land use discretions. We do have special assessment districts, which is why it's great that the city clerk was at the table today, and the opportunity to rebate taxes or put revenue, defer it, transit occupancy tax, and applying to other areas. So, you know, no matter how you cut it, everybody's going to have different needs. So if you look at AB2 as a chance to get additional funding, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the former redevelopment areas, and, you know, the CREA standard will help us, help you take a look at that. In areas that are more disadvantaged, commercial property is generally not sold or doesn't turn over as frequently as residential property, and so we don't have that opportunity to reassess and generate more tax increment, and particularly in areas that are much older in the city, where light industrial buildings have stayed in possession of families for 3 or 4 generations, and they're not going to change. So you have to look at that. Look at those considerations. They're both good tools, and you know, one has the eminent domain authority to take out hazardous uses, which is a good thing in areas that have been spot zoned or been just basically treated just disrespectfully over the last 40, 50 years. But the city's focus, if you decide to go in that direction, in the direction of an EIFD or even a CREA, obviously we have to negotiate something with the county. The less costly more efficient, obvious, direct way is if you decide you want to just allocate general fund dollars for economic development, then everything stays within the control of the legislative body and under mayoral and legislative control. And obviously, you would be your decision as to whether or not you obligate on a one-time basis or whether or not you obligate on an ongoing basis and all those caveats that go along with that financial crisis. It may be that your perspective would be that an AB2 is a better tool for underserved areas because it really goes to the heart of why they're underserved and also has, I think it's a Steinberg bill, I'm not quite sure the number, but it goes to sustainability and, corrects past issues on open space, green space, clean air, water, those kinds of things. And then an EIFD might be better for a much more targeted area. And so I can spread my comments out. Each one of you may have an area that will clearly fit within CREA, but there may be areas within your districts that lend themselves to, say, a historic character or a neighborhood retail corridor that has some reaching critical mass and needs a boost, or you go to the next community over because one has already transitioned, or I hate to use this word, the gentrificate, the G word, but that you may want to pull the next area along with it, depending on how much revenue is being generated. And let's see, what else can I tell you? Anyway, the comprehensive analysis that we'll bring back to you from the mapping should help, and then we have to go to an implementation plan. But again, I just want to put that other option out there. This is already within your control now if you just decide you want to go general fund and just get started.
So just to be clear, I mean, we're assembling a number of different tools in the toolbox that we can use differently in different parts of the city.
Yeah, it's like a menu.
In terms of revenue sources,
Yeah.
but even how those revenues are then, the mechanisms by which those revenues are applied to economic development
Right.
We're talking about three separate mechanisms now, one of which we could do today through the charter, anywhere we'd like. It's just a matter of setting it up. Maybe there are fewer options that we can use under the charter because we don't have the tax increment and we still have our inherent eminent domain authority, I guess. But the point being, there are many different things that we can use in different parts of the city. None of them are mutually exclusive.
Correct.
They can overlap or they can not.
If you go with your charter analysis, your JEDI package can go in however you define that as a package of incentives that go along with that. If you decide to go council, mayor, general fund, JEDI, menu.
So are you at a point yet, where's my list, where you can actually speak to the availability of any of the particular incentives that were included in my motion, or is that something that we'll be able to get in a report back?
We will get it in, you'll get that in an analysis, a very deep analysis in the report back.
Great. Very good. Members? Anything further? Mr. Blumenfield?
I know I missed a lot of the meeting, I was at a different meeting, but
You were doing the people's business,
yeah.
it's okay.
But following up on this and on our conversation the other day about the amount of, most of these sources, the big sources are all property tax revenue in one form or another. And with the loss of the CRAs, we no longer get any of the school property tax money. So we're really just talking about our own property tax increment and the county property tax increment, right?
For now, yeah.
For now. And do you by chance know what the percentage is of that? I know
Yeah.
it's of the overall tax increment compared to,
Yeah, I can just read it, and we gave a chart to everybody, so you'll see it on the second page, but basically, it was 27% funds came from the city under CRA, 25% funds came from the county, and this is the big hit, 46% of funds from the school district, and then 2% of funds from other taxing entities.
so a little less than half. So what that means in terms of when we think about these different entities, whether it's AB2, property tax type, or EIFD, we've got to get we get half the revenues we did from the CRA, which means to do the same amount that a CRA zone did, it would have to be twice as big or twice as long.
Time-wise, yeah, you're right. You either have to spread it out longer or make it bigger. Yeah,
Right, which is good. I mean, at least that means that there's a tool there, but just for a sense of scale, trying to understand the tools that we have in the toolbox, it's not nearly as strong as what we had before as a CRA.
no, but then we have nothing right now, so.
We have nothing, right, so
So, you know.
at least half, it gives us something to work with.
And here's another way to look at it. Another way to look at it is the precursor to a EIFD, CREA, or whatever menu you decide, because under CREA, you have to do extensive outreach and have public hearings. And then correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 3 stages, three-stage public hearing process. You may decide you want to do a charter approach with a general fund approach, at least for one time only, until the EIFD or the CREA or whatever you decide you want to do is up and running, so that you can get started next year and get something in motion.
I guess the more positive way to look at it is if we do any of these 3, we get to double our money with the county, if we get them,
Yeah. It'll allow you time to negotiate.
That 50% includes the county's tax increment.
Right, no, but I'm saying we're at about 25%.
Right.
If we just do it on our own. If we do an EIFD, it's half of what we have with CRA, but we get twice as what we have by ourselves because we get the county.
And that's assuming that both entities contribute the maximum, right? Because they could also voluntarily contribute a different percentage than they used to under CRA, which was at 25 and 25.
It's not all or nothing.
Right. Okay.
All right, members, anything else? Oh, okay. So, January, we're going to get a number of things back. Thank you, everybody. Clear on what we're bringing back?
Clear.
Okay, so we don't have to take any action on any. Oh no, we're advancing the motions. We're going to vote to advance the motions today. Right, so the 4 motions that are before us, unless there's any objection, we'll go ahead and approve those, and then we'll hear more detailed reports back at our meeting when we come back on January 13th. And by the way, just as a reminder, Ms. Perry, at that time we're going to also hear about the metrics issue that we discussed
Yeah.
for your
Yeah, we'll have it.
your strategy. And okay, so I think that's it for our action items. Thank you very much. I do have one card, which Mr. Spindler, although you've indicated this is item 4, I've already taken comment on item 4, but you can come on up and speak in public comment in any event, since that seems to have been your first choice anyway.
Yes. So the real scary thing is that they have the redevelopment agency is something that really bothers me because the mayor dissolved them. I mean, the governor dissolved them. And we have this HACLA, so we have sort of a shadow of what the redevelopment agency is. And I just fear if we go back and do what we were doing before, we're gonna blow a lot of chances because the whole paradigm of the city, including homeless housing and other opportunities, have been built away from a community redevelopment agency. So maybe jump-starting this would be a bad idea for the city, and instead we should continue with HACLA and this thing called MECLA, the city's financing authority. We've done okay without the CRA, but the CRA is still divesting itself of a lot of assets. And I think at least at a minimum, you should have an audit to make sure they completed that divestment first.
All right. Thank you very much. Members, did Ms. Perry leave already? Darn. Had one more thing. Oh, well. All right. If there's nothing further, then I guess I'll have to ask Ms. Perry offline. Anything else, members?
Meg is here. Meg.
Sorry. Just on our report back on the Jedi zones, if you could, when you come back, I'd like a couple of other things that I didn't specifically mention in the mention that I'd like to get back are a comparison with what sort of incentives other cities offer that we could include within our charter authority that I might not have specified in the motion? And then also, can we do a single CEQA study, if CEQA is even required, for all zones rather than doing it on a zone-specific kind of basis? Okay. Thank you very much. There being no other action before the committee, we are adjourned.